Kenya's President William Ruto inherited an economy saddled with debt, inflation, notable joblessness, and national pessimism. Now, despite the heights in infrastructure development of his predecessor, Uhuru Kenyatta, the debate on the cost and accusations of corruption have been front and center. The International Monetary Fund, which assisted the previous government, is willing to help again with some conditions. It has asked Kenya to broaden its tax base and scrap the fuel subsidy. Now that the fanfare has died down and the international and domestic celebration that ushered in the Ruto government, they're giving way to realistic negotiations of deals and implementations for the economy and policies in the first 100 days of his presidency. Now, while campaigning, the 56-year-old said, "If we take care of the bottom, we take care of everyone," pointing to his bottom-up economic plan. Now, 100 days into his presidency, is that the path William Ruto has put Kenya on? Joining me from Nairobi, Kenya, is Professor Iraki. He's an economist and also faculty member with the University of Nairobi in Kenya. Professor Iraki, welcome again to Business Edge. Compliments of the season to you.
Thank you. How are you? Good morning.
I'm fantastic, and good afternoon to you there. So let's start in terms of sort of grading this 100 days of President William Ruto. It's necessary to know what he promised or what he sort of alluded to that he would do in his time as president. And he made a number of promises while campaigning, the Hustler Fund, focusing on the bottom to take care of everyone. So, Prof, let's go through that at first. In terms of the standout economic promises that President Ruto made, take us through some of those.
It was the first time in Kenya's history when an election was won based on economics. Previously, it was about politics, but this time, both opponents, William Ruto and Raila Odinga, focused on economics, and he made a lot of economic promises. One of them was that the prices of common commodities like wheat flour, like maize flour, like other prices like petroleum would go down. So people are waiting that as soon as we get a new president, the prices will go down. They have not gone down. They have not gone down. People are promised jobs. We haven't had as many jobs as possible. So basically, most of the promises he made were about economics. But I think the politicians did not tell us that some of the problems we faced economically were out of their control, like the price of petroleum or the price of food, which some of which is important. So I think the promises were good, but the reality is different.
Okay, so let's take it back a bit in time. We have former President Uhuru Kenyatta, who some would say did make a lot of infrastructural developments happen with Kenya. But also while he was in office, the debts ballooned as well. There were conversations with the National Assembly on continuing to move the debt ceiling, the subsidy issue. COVID happened, and to the tail end of his administration, Russia and the Ukraine crisis. Now, the International Monetary Fund laid out a number of reforms that Kenya was advised to go through, which also included scrapping interventions, including the petroleum and electricity subsidies, which were meant to ease things for Kenyans that were hit hard by the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Bretton Woods Institution also pushed for a new tax policy to widen the tax net and also had asked Kenya to freeze salary increases for civil servants. In terms of that IMF advice and how it sort of has straddled the two administrations, where does President William Ruto stand on that?
That's an interesting question because the IMF reforms, anytime they have been made, anytime IMF has promised to give the government money, it always comes up with conditions. And most of the time, these conditions are politically very unpalatable. So whether it is President Uhuru, whether it is President Ruto, they are always very reluctant to implement the IMF suggestions. Because when you look at things like making some employees go home, that is politically very unpalatable. When you talk of reducing subsidies, you are making the prices go down, go up. That's what they promised in their campaign manifesto. So the IMF promises are usually good. You get the money, but the political trade-offs are usually very high. So most of the time, whether it is President Uhuru, whether it is President Ruto, they're usually very reluctant to implement that. But we have seen some changes in the last few weeks. The government is trying to tighten the tax base so that more people pay taxes. Some taxes are supposed to go up from the 1st of January, like capital gains tax, land raise tax. We are seeing some movement, but we think it is not as fast as expected.
So you're seeing some movement, but not as much as you expect. Let's focus on the subsidy of petroleum products. And that was a major welfare package. And we've seen many African governments also use that across the spectrum, across the continent. But it's also been one of those packages that across the continent has its corruption controversies. In terms of how President Ruto is approaching the petroleum subsidy situation, in these first 100 days, what do you think of his movements, lack of, or the ones he's been doing in regards to that? Because we can't forget that the base of people who really did bring the president in are those who are in favor of the subsidy. So where does that leave him?
When the president got power about 100 days ago, he removed the subsidies from petroleum products, but not all the subsidies. So we think if the subsidy was removed completely, the price would be probably up by 20 shillings or more. So he left some subsidies. But what we have found interesting is that the price of petroleum products has been going down, but insignificantly, by about 1 shilling or 2. So I think it was politically made sense not to remove all the subsidies, because the prices would have hit the roof, and that's what he had promised the Kenyans, that the price would go down. So he is removing the subsidy on petroleum products, but slowly and very reluctantly. And I doubt whether all the subsidies on petroleum products will be fully removed. It might take some time, maybe by next year, or when the politics are not as hot as they are.
And I was going to follow up and ask you, is that more of a political decision there or an economic one that you think the president would have to make? And you've answered that. So let's also move into the tax conversation. That's been a conversation also with Kenya through the Uhuru Kenyatta administration. So the Kenya Revenue Authority targets is to raise more money through the minimum tax, and that has been dealt a blow. We saw the Court of Appeal, which termed it illegal. The three-judge bench court termed Section 12D of the Income Tax Act, which was introduced by the Finance Act of 2020 and amended by the Tax Law Amendment, as null and void. But we see that there is the continuing conversation about widening the tax net. You've also mentioned, of course, some of the taxes that are possibly coming in or will be increased for Kenyans in the near future. Where are we seeing President Ruto's move when it comes to taxation?
He has been very aggressive in the last 100 days. He has promised he's going to raise more taxes. Remember that Kenyans for the last 10 years have been complaining about the high level of debt. And I think President Ruto has decided that the best way to bridge the big deficit is to raise more taxes, because people don't want more debt. The problem of raising more taxes is that sometimes you hurt the people who are supposed to help. Because raising more taxes means that the price of goods and services will go up. So it is a double-edged sword. But I think the government is not relenting in terms of raising taxes. In fact, we have seen the Kenya Revenue Authority of exceeding its targets in the last few quarters. So I think that's a strategy I don't think is going to abandon. If Kenyans keep on complaining about debt, they have to pay their taxes.
Still on taxation, it's like a conversation we can't get away from. So the informal sector has been identified as a huge source of tax revenue by the IMF. But it's also a political base, as I mentioned earlier, for the president. How does he do this in a way that possibly doesn't alienate that political base, but does bring in a bit more taxes from this informal sector? It's unfortunately a situation we see replicated across the continent as well, where the informal sector is not formally paying taxes, but many do point to the fact that there is some level of taxation, maybe through state agents and third-party agents as well, that may not make it into the government coffers. How does President Ruto do this without necessarily alienating that base?
There are very good reasons why the informal sector would pay taxes like anybody else, because they constitute the majority of the economic players in this country. They also constitute the majority of voters in this country. So what I would suggest you should do is maybe raise the taxes from them slowly by slowly, because the more people who pay taxes, the rest we share the burdens. So if more people are incorporated in the tax bracket, the burden will become lighter for everybody. So what I would suggest you should do is maybe start raising taxes, give them a lower tax rate, then keep on increasing it, so that we encourage more people in the formal sector to pay taxes. And remember, most people got into the informal sector to avoid the exact taxes the president and other policymakers want them to pay. So if you want to get milk from a cow, you'd rather play music to it instead of harassing it. So it should be a diplomatic way of getting tax from the informal sector, not being too aggressive.
Not being too aggressive. One of the key highlights of President Ruto's campaign was the Hustler Fund. So, Prof, we have to go there now. And that was a major campaign promise. It was set up to give millions of Kenyans access to small loans for business, school, and other needs. And reportedly, some more than 8 million Kenyans have registered for the fund since it was launched on November 30th. The president says the fund will alleviate the living standards of many Kenyans, especially those who operate micro, small enterprises. But some people have complained that they're not able to get loans beyond 1,000 shillings as it may be. In terms of the Hustler Fund, we see the numbers mean people are interested, but is it really set up the right way? Will it really achieve its aim? Even though it might be the early days, what do you think?
That's an interesting question because I tried to get the Hustlers Fund myself. And I remember the maximum I got was 500 shillings, Kenyan shillings.
Wow.
It was about $5. And then as soon as you pay back the money, your remit keeps on going up. So I think the government is testing to see how it can be streamlined so that people can get more money and invest it. So as we talk today, you can't get enough money from Hustlers Fund to start an industry or to start a big business. It's probably more about consumption. So I believe with the time the government is going to streamline the Hustlers Fund so that you can get money to start a business, to start an industry, or to expand the present businesses. So I think it is a step in the right direction using the electronic systems, but I think we can do a lot to make Hustler Fund more effective, to stir and catalyze economic growth. We haven't done enough.
We haven't done enough. Let me ask you about the sentiment of things. Some of the surveys we've seen are showing that Kenyans may be a bit disillusioned with the administration, even though it is just the first 100 days. The promises were quite lofty. And as you said, this was a very economic-based election that Kenya had in August. But now the president is in. It's 100 days. We have the Hustler Fund. When you look at some of the political conversations, there's the gender parity conversation for his cabinet. Some also accusing him of actually retaliating against other people in the government who may not have supported him. But overall, what's the general sentiment when it comes to how Kenyans are feeling about the early days of President William Ruto's presidency, especially with the slashing of some of these subsidies that they really weren't expecting?
In an opinion poll that appeared in one of the papers, I think yesterday, the president was scoring about 52% in terms of sentiments about how he has performed since he became the president. So that's very close to the percentage he won when he became the president. So the sentiment is that people expected a lot, but those expectations must be filtered against the economic reality. War in Ukraine, some drought that had hit this country for the last 2 years, and very important, the fact that he inherited an economy that was not doing very well. So you cannot turn out an economy that has not been doing well for the last 10 years in 100 days. So we have to be patient. I remember when he became the president, he promised that maybe in 6 months things will turn out. Right? The reality seems to be you have to wait for about 1 year or 2 years before the economy turns down. So he has to convince the voters, the citizens of this country, that the economy is not like voting that takes 30 seconds or 30 minutes. Turning the economy around takes time. Sometimes it takes years. And he must cultivate that patience.
So we can't have this conversation without also talking about debts. Kenya's debt to the West and to China has become something that is a very, very big concern. So according to Fitch Ratings, the number of sovereigns facing large Eurobond bullet maturities will also increase. And Kenya is facing about a $12 billion payment in June of 2024. When the president was campaigning, he campaigned on slashing government debt, bringing down the prices of essential commodities, and of course, creating the Hustler Fund. When it comes to the debt conversation, in this first 100 days, what are we seeing President William Ruto say or do?
We haven't had a lot of discussion about debt. The only thing we remember was that the Chinese contracts would be made public. They were not really made public. But the debt issue has mostly been scattered around by politicians. And I think the reality has come into the current regime that they cannot live without debt. So what they might do is to reduce the rate at which debt is growing. That's why probably they are very aggressive on tax revenues, so that we raise more money, more government revenues through taxes. And very important, by reducing the government spending. I remember when the president got into power, he reduced the government spending by about 300 billion Kenyan shillings. Of course, that has an effect on the economic growth. But I think the president is determined to make sure that the debt situation in this country is put under control. And like any other economic decision, that will take time. It is not going to take place overnight. And Kenyans and the president and everybody must be patient.
You keep talking about Kenyans and the president being patient and also realizing it won't take place overnight. But when we listen to the president, who by all intents and purposes is a politician, he doesn't sort of give that impression that it's going to take time for us to bear this out. In a recent interview, the president targeted a nearly triple annual tax collection to about 5 trillion shillings, around $40.6 billion in 5 years. And he also says that government is going to reevaluate the budget to manage public debt in order to find a way around it. In real terms, what does this debt mean for Kenyans and the Kenyan economy, particularly going into 2023?
Remember that in the last 5 years, Kenya has got about 5% economic growth rate. And that was probably driven by a lot of capital infrastructure, the roads, the highways, the ports, and so on. So if we stop picking debts, and that is probably going to have an impact on economic growth. So the best thing to do is to make sure that as we correct taxes, they don't depress the economic growth, because that is going to reduce the number of jobs that are available. It is going to reduce the economic growth, and that's what they promised. So I think the government must strike a balance between debt, the tax, and reducing the waste to make sure that the economy grows. At the end of the day, it is about bottom-up economics, making promises to the people on the lower echelons of the society. And most of them have been very desperate economically, and they want quick results. So it's going to be politically very delicate to tell people you had to promise that something will be done in the first 100 days, that they have to wait longer. So this is where the president as a politician comes in, as opposed to president as an economist. But he must make sure that he balances the two.
All right, Prof, before we wrap things up, 2023 is around the corner. It'll stand and, basically extend into the president's 200 days and the continuation of his tenure. But we're still feeling the effects of the Russia-Ukraine conversation, the war there. We're also still feeling the effect of the rising interest rate hikes across the continent and across the world as it may be. We're feeling the effects of rising inflation and, the rising cost of living. When it comes to what things will look like economically in Kenya in 2023, under the William Ruto administration, what do you think that will look like?
Personally, I think 2023 will be better than 2022. I see prospects of peace in Ukraine. I see the rain has been falling in this country. The drought is not as bad as it expected. But the most important things have to change around in this country is to make sure that the goodwill the government is enjoying from the citizens, from the voters, is maintained for the whole of next year. But when I talk to the Kenyans on the streets, they seem to have a feeling that things can't get worse. They can only improve. So we are all very optimistic about 2023. The economy will turn loud, and Kenyans will get more jobs and put more money in their pockets. That's what they look forward to, and that's what everybody is looking forward to. That is Kenya, Nigeria, all over the world. So we can only hope for the best.
Very, very true. Hope for the best. All right, Professor XN Iraki, as always, thank you so much. Compliments of the season and possibly ahead of the times. Let me say Happy New Year to you and yours, and we'll see you again soon.
Happy holidays too.
The same to you. And it is a very difficult position that President William Ruto finds himself in, coming in while Kenya is battling high inflation, high unemployment, and of course many other issues. In terms of the president, he has said that Kenya will shun debts that is priced at more than 10%, debt being one of the largest controversial points of the election during August. Now, what we also know is that he said that any of the debts that comes in beyond 10%, the country will not be signing. Right now, they're looking for things around 5% if possible, and they will go to look and relook at other sources. The last borrowing that Kenya did came in at 14%, and the weighted average yield on the 14-year Treasury bond was about 13.938%. And there's a lack of mouth-watering yields from the government, which could have helped to spur lending to the private sector as banks are looking for other opportunities. So William Ruto has his work cut out for him. The 100 days have come with mixed reactions from economists and analysts and as well as Kenyans, but we'll see what things look like as they enter into the new year. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, we get into the international business scene and give you the latest from there. And then before the show wraps things up, we'll look at how the sub-region of West Africa performed economically in 2022. Please stick around.